Dear ministers, professors, esteemed guests and participants, I'm honored by your invitation to speak at your conference today about the critical task of enhancing early childhood education and care in Palestine. My apologies for not being able to speak to you in real time. At this moment, I'm still on a flight across the Atlantic to South America. What's the purpose of education and care in our time? We have arrived at a critical juncture that requires us as educators, advocates and activists to engage in critical conversations about what we value and hold for true in our educational work with young children, in practice, policy and research. How can we, collectively and in solidarity, work to not just react to a dramatically changing world, but to proactively bring about change for the better, for justice, equity and sustainability? Together, we must and can fundamentally rethink and reclaim the purpose of early childhood education for our times, from a radical position of concrete hope and capability. Writing in 1925, Austrian psychoanalyst Siegfried Bernfeld, in his book Sisyphus, or The Limits of Education, offered the following definition of what education is all about. He said, education is the sum total of societal reaction to the fact of ontogenetic development. That is a bit of a mouthful, but his wide-ranging definition has, I suggest, profound implications as we endeavour to reimagine education for all, early childhood education for all children in the 21st century. It basically means education begins at birth. It means education is so much more than schooling, and it means education is profoundly political, as it is the sum total of our societal reaction, which means there will be different points of view, there will be struggle, there will be arguments about how to respond to the fact that young children develop. A caveat here. While Siegfried Bernfeld's critical work is highly relevant for our debate today, it is of course impossible to cite a writer who declared himself a Zionist without pointing out that the socialist utopia he had in mind was violently turned into hell for the Palestinian people. So at this point I can only recommend Arish Savas Khouri's book on the devastating role of the Zionist left in the Nakba and ongoing colonization. The world we live in today has been described as the age of the polycrisis. Climate catastrophe, loss of biodiversity, forced migration and displacement, violence, war and the erosion of democracy and international law. Or, as Edgar Morin puts it in his Manifesto for a New Millennium, we are facing a complex intersolidarity of problems, crises, uncontrolled processes and the general crisis of the planet. And you can see some of these mutually reinforcing crises in this world that I put together for you on this slide. Writing in the journal Lancet this month, Helen Skouteris, Michael Marmot and Sharon Bessel reiterate that children, as UNICEF has stated, are the silent victims of the crisis. They ask, how do we create child-inclusive societies under these circumstances, where every child thrives and has the best start in life, where intergenerational disadvantage is redressed, and where child poverty is ended? They point to three critical areas of action that are all highly relevant for early child education and care. First, it is about prioritizing the implementation of transformative collaboration between policymakers, public bodies, and communities to improve outcomes for children. Second, it is about reclaiming the public good through child-centered regulatory frameworks. And third, it is about valuing the time to care for children and to build meaningful and responsive relationships with them. In any case, as we reimagine early childhood education and care for our present times and for the years ahead, we cannot go back to an imagined normality. As the saying goes, normal was the problem in the first place. Here's an example of the writing of another dead philosopher, Antonio Gramsci, writing in the early 20th century reminds us that we live in liminal times, in times that he says where the crisis consists precisely in the fact that the old is dying and the new cannot be born. And he points out that in this interregnum a great variety, as he says, of morbid symptoms appear. So we live in liminal times, but sometimes you can get the impression that education, remember Siegfried Bernfeld's sum total of society's reaction, seems somewhat stuck in a 20th century time loop, with its colonial impositions, its addiction to unlimited growth, its naive belief in progress as the only possible future. Can we imagine instead a right to an education that is about transformation, justice, and survival? Some first conclusions at this stage. I think we have to admit and we have to acknowledge that existential crises are no longer the exception. They have become the new normal for humanity. And, as has been documented, children are the silent victims of the situation we're in. And in consequence, terms and concepts like resilience, survival, equity, justice, peace, they are the concepts that will have to be at the very center of our discussion about early childhood development, education and care as we plan for the decades ahead. And this applies, I want to underscore, to both individual programs and services and at systems and policy level. And we do know that resilient early childhood systems require multisectoral policies based on a universal right to education for all children from birth. But let's talk about the concept of resilience for the moment. According to figures published by Save the Children earlier this year, up to 21,000 children are estimated to be missing in Gaza, presumed dead beneath the rubble, killed by Israel, harmed beyond recognition by Israeli explosives, buried in unmarked or mass graves, detained or abducted by Israel. What does resilience even mean in such contexts? I got out my dictionary and I looked it up. Resilience, states the Oxford Dictionary, is the capacity to withstand or recover quickly from difficulties. But I suppose as we witness the killing of children, fostering the resilience in early child education and care without fighting for justice becomes ethically impossible. There's growing consensus that early child education and care can only be effective as one crucial part of an integrated and multisectoral policy framework based on children's rights, and as a high-level policy document of the European Union puts it, early child education and care provision needs to be one part of an integrated child's rights-based package of policy measures to improve outcomes for children and break intergenerational cycles of disadvantage. But what does it actually mean to break intergenerational cycles of poverty and disadvantage? Where do we start? Perhaps by acknowledging that they are the direct consequence of persistent intergenerational and global cycles of unfair advantage. So what do? We can start by challenging the myth of quality as the only solution. We can start by stop treating early child education as a panacea, as a resolve all for fixing social problems caused by dysfunctional global exploitative economic systems, for instance. Our existing economic and social models are built on inequality. They are designed to create and maintain it. We can start by recognizing early child education and care as a profoundly political and ethical project instead that addresses injustice and inequality at individual, collective, and systemic levels. We can connect questions of social and environmental justice, local and global justice, but we have to be careful. We have to beware of repeating the myth of the early child education and care being the panacea. This brings us to the importance of intergenerational and international solidarity as a key principle that must inform our early childhood policy and practice work. This is what Eduardo Galeano, the Uruguayan writer, has to say about solidarity. He writes, "Unlike solidarity, which is horizontal and is exercised as equals, Charity is practiced from the top down, humiliates those who receive it, and never alters power relations even a little. In the best of cases, ever. There will be justice, but in high heaven. Here on earth, charity does not disturb injustice. It only intends to hide it. Considering the situation of young children and their communities in Palestine, there are things we all can do in our local context and as an international early childhood professional and academic community. We can refuse to normalize apartheid. We can refuse to be silenced when addressing difficult issues in our own contexts, our universities, our schools, our communities. We can be an ally. We can show solidarity, for instance, by responding to the quest of BDS and the Palestinian campaign for the academic and cultural boycott of Israel. And we can, to sum up, not give up. To conclude this, I leave you with a quote from Brazilian educator Paulo Freire, who reminds us that in the face of atrocities, fatalism is not an option. He says, "My discourse in favor of dreaming, of utopia, of freedom, of democracy is the discourse of those who refuse to settle and do not allow the taste for being human, which fatalism deteriorates, to die within themselves." Thank you.